Hello and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC Ep.16 with Dr. Jeremy Sharp, host of the Testing Psychologist podcast. Hello again out there to everybody in podcast land. As always, thank you for checking our podcast out and stopping by. Just a quick reminder before we get going, the number to call in if you have a question is 717-897-0577, or you can email questions to info@parentfamilysolutions.com and just throw podcast question into the subject line. In today's episode, I get to share a conversation that I had with Dr. Jeremy Sharp, who is a licensed psychologist and a clinical director at the Colorado Center for Assessment and Counseling out in Colorado, and he has a private practice that he founded in 2009, and that actually grew to include 12 different practitioners, full administrative staff, the works. He earned his undergraduate degree in experimental psychology from the University of South Carolina, and then got his master's and his PhD in counseling psychology at Colorado State University. And he is the host of the Testing Psychologist podcast and lives there in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I really wanted to sit down and talk with him about just sort of a testing psychology 101. So often you'll hear that term of psych testing get thrown around, and that can really mean just so many things. And a lot of times, you'll hear that from school or sometimes from work. It can cover just so much ground, everything from ADHD testing fitness for duty and, ability to use a weapon, carry a weapon, things like that. A lot of times when people hear that term, testing psychology or psych testing, a lot of times it conjures up images of this interrogation over hours and hours. You're hooked up to a polygraph and you're having to do a Rorschach inkblot test. And it's often far from it. It's something that is much more commonplace in today's world, definitely in academic settings, with students needing, an IEP plan, an individualized education plan, and in order to get, access to services that they might need or things like that, they often require psychological testing to determine, okay, what all is this person dealing with? What are the actual needs? And that's part of why I wanted to have him on the show. He's just such an amazing clinician and wealth of information, super genuine, just very approachable, very willing to share of his knowledge and just, sit and talk with anybody. In addition to that, just an avid runner, constantly out there pushing himself, involved in multiple different things. So, like I said, I'm really excited to get to share this with you. Thank you so much, Jeremy, and just welcome to the On the Couch podcast. I've been really looking forward to being able to just sit down and talk with you about testing, psych testing. Just welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really glad to be here. Anytime I can talk about testing, that's a good day.
Definitely. Yeah. And so as I said in the bio, you have the Testing Psychologist podcast. You have the practice there in Fort Collins, the Colorado Center for Assessment and Counseling. So, tell me about your background. How'd you get into testing?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think like a lot of us in doctoral programs, I had that training in graduate school in assessment and diagnostic testing. I really enjoyed it back then, and I spent a couple years working for a neuropsychologist in a practicum experience, and then I was the assistant director of our community clinic, which really kind of focused on assessment. So I did it. It was pretty heavy in grad school. Loved it. Had an advisor who was really strong in assessment, and that was his specialty. So that was a big part of my training. And then I took a couple years off, I suppose, while I did my internship and postdoc. But then when I circled back and got into private practice, recognized that it was just a huge need here in the community. And it's always been a part of my private practice. And, over the first couple of years, I did do some therapy in my practice, but over the last several, I've really only focused on testing, and specifically with kids these days. So it's just, a combination of community need and just loving the structure of it. It's very concrete, I think, and can really provide clients with some helpful information and what's going on with their kiddos and how to move forward and help them.
Definitely. Yeah. There's, we could probably have multiple conversations over multiple hours just about all the nuances and different tests and what that means. So kind of starting off with just testing 101, kind of break it down. What is it? What does that entail?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I'll speak primarily, as a pediatric clinician, but I think this, all of this applies to adult assessment as well. But it's really this question, when someone comes for testing or for an assessment, it's just trying to answer the general question of what's going on and what do I do about it. So, for parents, for example, that might be they come in with a specific question like, does my kid have autism, or does my kid have a learning disorder, or even something more general like, why is my kiddo struggling in school or, with his behavior at home? So we kind of start with that general question or premise, and then we use any number of standardized measures or instruments to try to measure cognitive ability, personality functioning, emotional functioning, and even environment and parenting stress and things like that. And so we use all these measures. You've certainly heard of IQ tests. We have academic measures, personality tests, all of those sorts of things. And we administer all these measures and then pull all the data together and come up with some hopefully coherent picture of what's going on and again, what you might do about it. So once we figure out the diagnostic picture, or at least the clinical picture, we can offer recommendations that are really specifically tailored, to that individual based on what we found out.
Okay. And I think so much with popular media, obviously, Rorschach gets a lot of attention, and definitely IQ testing. But in terms of, a parent reaching out to you, or another counselor in the community that, refers for psych testing, and I fall victim to this myself of, we throw that term around of like, you need to go for testing, and so how do they enter into service, and what does that look like when you schedule with them, and what can they expect upon coming for testing?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of the referrals that we get come from medical providers around town, so physicians, pediatricians, some neurologists. We also get a lot of referrals from schools and from other therapists or counselors in the community. So at least for us, that's really all it takes to get into our practice, is just, having someone refer you over. And from there, at least, in our practice, we do a pretty structured 3-part process. The first step is an interview. So we meet with the individual or the parent for a couple hours and just ask a lot of questions, try to get a good idea of what's going on and at least what their concerns are. And then we use that information to design a testing day, or a testing battery. And we kind of pick the instruments that would be most appropriate. So then the individual, comes back for the testing day, which is usually, at least for us, one long day. So some clinicians break it into maybe 2 or 3 days, but we'll do like a 5 or 6 hour stretch and just try to knock it all out.
Sure.
With breaks.
Oh, yeah.
we do breaks.
Caveat. Yeah. They're not just locked
Especially
in there.
With kids,
Well, and yeah, of course, immediately that was where my mind went to, is like, oh, man, you think of, a kid who's coming in for ADHD testing where, it's already kind of been identified that, they got trouble sitting still and paying attention. Yeah. How do they do that?
Yeah. Great question. So some not so well, I will say that. Some require a little bit more energy on our part. But we do our best. I think there are a couple things that make it easier than it sounds. One is that it's a novel situation. It's not school. It's one-on-one, which a lot of kids seem to prefer. And the way that testing is structured, the kids are doing, or even the adults, they're doing something new, or a new task, a different task every 5 or 10 minutes. So it switches pretty frequently and it keeps them pretty engaged. And we tell them from the outset that, hey, you can take a break, you can get a snack, you can get a drink, you can go to the bathroom whenever you want. And that usually keeps them, fairly engaged throughout the day. Now, some kids, we got to get up and run around or do jumping jacks or push-ups or tour the office or whatever it might be. But for the most part, kids say that it's better than being in school, and it's kind of interesting and it's kind of fun. So yeah, it goes okay most of the time.
Nice. And in terms of the interview, so on our end, usually that throwing around that terminology of like the biopsychosocial, and you're collecting medical history and nutrition and school history and all of those things. Is that what's happening in that interview?
Yeah, absolutely. Biopsychosocial, I think, is a good term for it. So breaking that down, just the way that I do it is I just start with family history and what the family, the home looks like, who lives there, what are the relationships like, ask about medical history. And that's pretty comprehensive. So definitely diving into sleep, diet, exercise, medication, of course, any significant medical history like illnesses or hospitalizations or head injury. I mean, any number of things. Yeah.
Okay. And that interview sort of comes standard with every client. Are there other either assessment tools or other things that sort of come standard with every, I just interviewed an assistant principal, and in the podcast interview, he talked about, the ACE study, like adverse child experiences and things like that. Are there standard ones that come with every test, no matter what, or testing battery, excuse me? Yeah,
it depends. I would say we will always do an IQ test as part of a battery.
Okay.
Because that, an IQ test, kind of like you said, has a certain reputation in the media and pop culture. But for us, the IQ test is a great way to just get a broad look at cognitive ability and what someone is kind of bringing to the table. And then we use that as the basis to compare a lot of the other testing to. So an IQ test gives us, a lot of good information really about just what their brain's up to at a basic level and what they're theoretically capable of on these other measures.
And as a bit of a sidebar, in terms of that IQ test, is that is a standard, every testing psychologist would do the same IQ test, or, some are doing the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or some are doing like a Halstead-Reitan, or,
Yeah, it really depends. I think the majority of folks probably use the WISC, but there are several options out there. Stanford Binet is a big one. There's one called the KABC. There's one called the RIAS. I mean, we have all these acronyms for different tests.
A lot of alphabet soup there.
Right. It's hard to keep track of sometimes. But I'd say the WISC is probably the most popular at this point.
Okay.
And whichever ones we use, I think that's important. I get this question a lot is, are these standardized measures, or are these tests that I made up in my basement, or what? So yes, they are totally standardized. They've been normed on, thousands, if not tens of thousands of kids across the country or adults across the country. So these are kind of gold standard measures.
Well, and a lot of times, you sort of get sometimes you get the pushback from parents. They're kind of rattling the cage a little bit to like, so how qualified are you to do that? Well, I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night. Like, no, this is this is pretty standard.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
It's funny how many people ask that, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. And in terms of, just testing itself, is that typically covered by insurance? Is that something out of pocket? How does that get navigated? Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, so you're asking at a really interesting time. I say they,
Yes.
the powers that be, whoever that is, literally changed all of our testing billing codes on January 1st. So
Oh, wow.
At this point, we're not sure if insurance pays for it or not because nobody's really getting paid. But I digress. Generally speaking, yes, most insurance plans have at least some coverage for psych or neuropsych testing. That's a big myth, I think, with testing, is I've heard a lot of clinicians particularly believe that insurance won't cover it. But that is not true. We are primarily insurance-based practice, and we do fine. And yeah, insurance reimbursement is pretty common, to be honest, especially from the client perspective. Yeah, your plan, and it's typically covered the same as any mental health benefit. So if your plan covers counseling, it would likely cover testing, unless it is you're going specifically for a medical concern, like the primary diagnosis for testing would be like a stroke or cancer or a brain injury or a genetic disorder or something like that. Then it maybe falls under your medical plan, and you might need to check that out specifically.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of, practitioners, it's the same as any other practice. Some are private pay, some do take insurance. That just depends on who you go to see. Yeah.
And are there particular trends that you're seeing in terms of the, issues that people are seeking for testing, or I'll kind of leave that open-ended a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think the big three that we see in our practice are autism, learning disorders like dyslexia, and ADHD. Those are the primary concerns.
Kind of the bread and butter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It seems like lately, and I could be wrong, but I feel like I read this somewhere, there's also sort of a rise of disruptive behavior, with kids in the home. So we see quite a bit of, yeah. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
So we see a lot of that too. So trying to separate out, is this, a brain disorder, quote unquote, versus, mood like anxiety or bipolar or depression, or maybe even something more serious, or is it just kind of an environmental piece that we need to dig into a little bit and maybe talk about the home environment.
And to pump your tires a little bit, I just listened to the interview you did right before Christmas with Dr. Nig on ADHD, and that was an amazing interview. He's clearly got a lot of information, a lot of background in researching ADHD. So I will definitely include links to your podcast and would encourage anybody to check that out.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, he was a great guest. He's so knowledgeable.
So yeah, with that, kind of moving into, I guess let's start with, ADHD. What do you typically do what tests are you conducting for an ADHD assessment? Sure.
So I will probably start with the disclaimer that our battery, the battery would likely vary depending on who you go see, but there should be the same sort of core elements. For most of us, we would do, again, an IQ test. If there is any concern about an academic issue, which there often is with ADHD, there's a lot of, co-occurring learning disorders with ADHD. We'll evaluate academic skills as well, so reading, writing, math, spelling, so forth. For us, we do we try to dig in a little bit more to the executive functioning side. So we administer a battery of executive functioning measures. It's called the DCAFs is one of them, and that really looks at skills like impulse control, cognitive flexibility, speed of thinking, planning, organization, goal-directed behavior, things like that. Mm-hmm. Let's see, we also look at learning and memory, both in the visual and verbal formats. And that's kind of the cognitive side. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. We do what's called a continuous performance test. This is a test that is super boring and purposefully designed to be that way so that it really can gauge how well someone can pay attention to a really boring task.
It's almost like Joe Sanak talks about the vigilance decrement kind of idea of falling off over time.
Yes. Yep. So that's the cognitive side, and then on the behavioral side, we always do a school observation with ADHD to see what's going on in the classroom.
Now, but sorry to interrupt, but you're saying where you or somebody would go to the school and observe, or you're saying getting like a behavior checklist from teacher, or both?
Both, yeah. So we go to the school and observe in the classroom for usually about an hour. Is what we can get from the district. And yeah, it's just nice to see school behavior live versus hearing a description.
Sure.
So we do that. And then we also, like you said, get behavior checklists from the teacher and from the parent as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so those look at different things. I mean, we have like a broad-based behavior checklist that looks at any number of behaviors. Then we have more specific ones that look right at ADHD symptoms. So we give a couple, 2 or 3 different behavior checklists. That's part of the battery too. And then, of course, we interview the kid. We hang out.
Always important.
Right.
Get it from the horse's mouth.
There you go.
And I'll throw in the sort of the legal caveat, as I imagine you would as well, of, you can't speak on laws state to state, but how do you handle if, one parent wants the testing and one parent doesn't? I imagine you run into that a lot with, blended families and divorce and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some nuances there for sure, but generally speaking, and at least in Colorado, where I practice, if there are separated parents, let me back up. That's a complicated question.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it all comes down to medical decision making. So most of the time, if parents are still married, they both have medical decision making. So if they're separated, usually one parent can still bring the child in if they're separated but married, and there hasn't been like a court order about who has medical decision making.
Sure.
If they are divorced, we just as a policy have to get both parents' consent to the evaluation, unless it's explicit in a court order that only, that one parent has 100% medical decision making.
Sure.
Yeah.
Parental rights have been terminated or something like that. Yeah, sure.
Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. But yeah, we always err on the side of caution with that. I made that mistake one time, and that's about all it took. Where
I had a very angry parent.
So here's what happened. So I was evaluating, a kiddo. One parent brought the kid in. Other parent was actually incarcerated, and so I took that to mean
not available.
Parental rights. Yeah, they were not available. They could not give consent for the evaluation, and I think it was maybe 4 or 5 months down the road, I was hanging out in my office doing some paperwork, and someone storms into my office. I mean, without knocking, of course, stormed into the office and slammed the report down on my desk and said, "So you just see kids without their parents' permission?" And it was the parent who had been incarcerated, 6 months earlier. So that's about all it took to get my form straight and make sure that we have permission from both parents.
Wow. I could completely see where that would be all it took.
Oh, yeah. Man. Yeah, that stuck in my mind.
You're listening to OTC Episode 16 with Dr. Jeremy Sharp. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
Life is hard, but Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. Our board-certified counselors are easy to talk to and offer a safe, encouraging environment to help you with your unique needs. We specialize in helping clients of all ages deal with depression, anxiety, marriage issues, screen addiction, and ADHD, just to name a few. We now have daytime and evening appointments available in Harrisburg and Lancaster and accept most major insurance plans. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
Moving into autism spectrum disorder, same thing there. You said, okay, child interview the parents, IQ test, and then from there, what other goes into the battery? And I guess I would explain. We throw around that term battery, so usually that means a group of testing assessments or tools into that 1 day or 2 day block or whatever. Correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's a good thing to clarify. That word we use that so easily, but that is what it is. Yeah.
Well, and I think a lot of people, they hear that and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be like locked in a room under you think of like FBI interrogation scene, like,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we only use handcuffs for part of the assessment.
It's a whole other test.
No, so the battery for autism spectrum is similar in those core components, like you mentioned, but we'll throw in the measures that look really specifically at the primary elements of autism. So, social and reciprocal communication and restricted and repetitive interest. So there are a couple measures that are really geared toward assessing those symptoms. One is called the ADOS. It's kind of a lot of people have called it a gold standard over the years. The authors, I think, have said more recently that they're kind of backing away and they're saying, like, don't just use the ADOS, let it be a part of a larger battery and just one piece of information. But yeah, we do use the ADOS, which is a series of structured interactions that are really geared to pull, those reciprocal social exchanges and give the child or adult an opportunity to either display or not display some repetitive behaviors or interests.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So we do that. We also have a couple of behavior checklists that are specifically geared toward autism spectrum symptoms. But otherwise, the battery is largely similar. We do a school observation, child interview, parent interview, IQ test. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And in terms of just overall testing, assessment, myths, what do you typically come into contact with that most people, have bought into this myth or this misnomer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a big one that comes in, especially from parents, I can kind of tackle the parents versus clinicians. From parents, a big one is it's just going to label my child or tell me what's wrong with my kid. That is a hard one to overcome, but I think that the way that I view testing and assessment is that it just gives us a really good in-depth look at what is going on, period. And we like to focus just as much on the strengths and how to play those up as much as any of the challenges and things that might need some more support. So, so there's, throughout the process, there's definitely a component of diagnosis. That's often a part of the assessment process. But for me, there's a lot of parents are scared of what that means and like having a label and will that stigmatize them at school or, wherever else. And in my experience, that just has not happened as much as parents think it will. And it actually usually helps clarify things and send them in the right direction to know like what interventions might be appropriate. So they're not spinning their wheels and just trying to guess or, integrate all their opinions that might be out there. That's a big one. Yeah. Looked like you were going to jump in.
Well, yeah, I just wasn't sure if there were other myths you typically run into? I know that's definitely probably the biggest.
Sure. I mean, the other one, kind of like we alluded to, is it's expensive. Like insurance doesn't pay for it. And like I said, insurance, typically will pay for it if you have mental health benefits, at least to some degree. So that's helpful. What are some other myths from parents? I don't know. Those are probably the big ones. Those are the ones that come to mind right off the bat.
Sure.
And then for clinicians, I often run into at least a question of, how is this going to be helpful? Will this give me anything I don't already know about? And those kinds of questions. So I like to try to address that, and I liken it to like taking an X-ray versus just looking at someone as we typically do.
With our eyes.
Right. It really gives us some, a good look kind of internally to what someone's brain is up to and how that integrates with personality and emotional functioning and so forth.
Well, and that brings up a good point or a good question, hopefully, for the clinicians that are out there. Do you prefer to speak to the clinician, the referring clinician prior to, and kind of get a sense of like, okay, why have you referred them to me, or do you prefer to do that afterwards, or yeah?
I would say it most typically happens in the middle of the process, like usually after the parent interview, but before the testing day. But talking with other clinicians is a big part of the process because typically they have a long-term relationship with the person, and that's super helpful. Yeah.
And to jump back to you said the sort of the big three with ADHD, autism, and the intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities. Obviously, that's a pretty large landscape in and of itself. And again, following the same kind of model. But are you seeing any front runners in terms of dyslexia or dysgraphia or math comprehensions or things like that?
Yeah. We see dyslexia more than anything else, I think. Just in terms of overall prevalence. But with learning disorders, it's like if you have one, there's a high likelihood you're going to have others. Yeah. And so we know the most about dyslexia in terms of research and practice and intervention. I think math and writing are kind of lagging behind in that a little bit. So we just, I think, naturally pay more attention to the reading. And, for a lot of students, reading is sort of the focal point of education in those early years. And so I think parents are more tuned into reading issues as well, and teachers. So I think just by virtue of those circumstances, we get a lot more questions about reading disorder. But when someone says reading, then that automatically gets me thinking about math and writing as well, because they typically go hand in hand.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you were saying the benefit is that clearer picture, sort of the X-ray versus the eyesight view of things, and really sort of that full picture. Once you have done the testing battery, what can parents then expect from there?
Yeah, I think that's the best part. Like that's why people come for the assessment, is like the what do I do about it kind of question. So after we do the testing and pull everything together, we circle back and do what we call a feedback session with the parent or the individual if it's an adult. And that's where we go over all the results and really try to spend time on the recommendations. So we use all that data that we gathered and the diagnostic picture and the person's profile, and then put together a set of recommendations that are geared toward supporting them and helping address the challenges that they're showing. So that might be recommendations, either diagnostic specific recommendations, like here's what you do for these ADHD symptoms, or here's what you do to help with a reading disorder. Here are the interventions that we know work. But it also might just be general recommendations for a setting like home or school, or medical options to pursue, things like that. So the idea is that people walk away with a pretty concrete sense of what would be helpful and where to go next. So a roadmap, I think, of what would be most helpful.
Okay. And in terms of bedside manner and delivery of that, I imagine you come into contact with pretty wide variety of, how people respond to that.
Yeah.
And as a therapist, a lot of times I have to work with a lot of families and kids on, accepting the diagnosis and sort of the grieving process that can come with that sometimes. And then how do you, especially other siblings, sometimes they're not as accepting of their siblings' diagnosis.
Sure.
That sort of, well, he gets out of jail for free because, he's got dyslexia or whatever, things like that. So.
Yeah. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. That word grieving process, or that phrase, I think is really, really accurate. I was doing a feedback session yesterday, and some parts of the feedback were maybe not unexpected, but certainly heavier to have it in black and white, to have someone actually say, yes, your child, has autism spectrum. And I think that's where, for a lot of us, that's where the therapist part kicks in. And, you got to deviate from the data and make room for a little bit of grieving in the session and talk through that and just validate that it can be a big deal. It's a huge deal.
Definitely.
To talk through somebody's, and I was reading actually just last night an article on how bedside manner. This is fairly intuitive, but bedside manner can actually reduce the severity of symptoms independent of any other intervention, and that's crucial.
Well, and going back to the interview you did with Dr. Nigg, you were talking about that normalizing is a pretty big part of it. And I think for a lot of us, I think so many parents especially, you're so worried about the results and what is this going to mean? And is my kid going to be labeled? And how do I tell them? And then what do you do with all of that? So I think the delivery on that can be huge. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I found that honestly, a big part of feedback is just letting parents know that it's not their fault and they are normal and that their kid's alone and they're not alone, and even just knowing that in itself can go a long way. Definitely. Independent of other recommendations.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that. That's definitely worth repeating that. And I think one of the myths a lot of times is, whose fault is this?
Yeah.
What was the cause of, especially autism spectrum disorder?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's amazing. Well, and you and I are both parents, and you can carry a lot of responsibility and guilt and all sorts of things about why your kid does what they do. And
not at all. What are you talking about?
It's just me.
Yeah. Sure. No, definitely. So I do have a question from online from a listener. A mother, Carissa in Philadelphia, she had wanted to ask, so how do I know if I need testing, either for myself or for my child? Mm-hmm. And then a follow-up to that one is, let's say it's a teenager. How do I talk to my teenager on the front end about, okay, we're getting you testing?
Oh, sure. Yeah, great questions. Let's see. So first one, how do I know if I need testing? There are a few ways to know this. Some parents will just jump gun right from the beginning. If there is a behavior or some sort of struggle, and it's impacting your life, and
my 3-year-old throws temper tantrums.
Yeah, there you go. Some will just say, okay, I want to know what's going on, and I'm finding an assessment. I would say the majority, though, will have some contact with either a pediatrician or another counselor or a teacher maybe. And it's, when you get to that point where there's been one level of contact / intervention, and it's still kind of unclear what's going on. So if people are if it's not immediately obvious, like, hey, this is happening because of this change in the environment or because of this medical concern or whatever. If there's still that question of like, what's going on here? I wonder why this is happening. That's a great time to get an assessment.
Okay.
I am, this is the way that I operate. But if there's any question of ADHD or a learning disorder, I think that's a great time to get an assessment, simply because each of those concerns could be any number of other things that are kind of masquerading as either ADHD or a learning disorder, So like problematic behavior in school. Well, that could be because a kid does have ADHD. It could be because they have a learning disorder. It could be because they have anxiety. It could be because they can't remember anything. I mean, it could be any number of things. So clarity is big. Let's see. Another great time, I think, to get an assessment from a client perspective is I've tried to fix it myself and it's not working, or I've tried X medication, or I've gone to X counselor and things still aren't improving. And then we can really dig in and figure out what might be driving them.
Okay.
And then how do you talk to them about it? So the way that yeah. So the line that I always have parents use is something along the lines of, this is something that we're going to dig in, we're going to see what your brain is up to and figure out, what you're good at and, how to support you in areas that are a little tougher. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the general line. Beyond that, I'll tell parents to use any open door that their kid has already opened for them. So like if their kid has said, I'm really having trouble in school, or math is just really hard for me, or I don't know why I'm sad all the time. Like any open door the kid has already given, we can walk through that and say like, hey, this is someone who specializes in figuring out like exactly why math is hard for you and what we might do about it. And then there you go. I do not recommend that parents tell their kid that they're going to get diagnosed or mention specific diagnoses necessarily, or figure out what's wrong with you or anything like that.
Yes, now is your chance to tell all the parents out there what you please do not do this. Do not say this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And to dovetail off of that, I'm usually one in the intake process. I will tell parents like, look, do not just kidnap your kid and bring them to me. That usually does not go well. That makes my job harder.
Right.
And then it turns it into almost like the principal's office. You're in trouble and you're being brought here. I imagine you would echo that as well.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I still get a surprising number of kids who have no idea why they're there, but that's another.
Yeah. A whole other episode. Well, and that brings up the question of how do you handle when, I'm sure you get kids that are like, I want nothing to do with you. I'm not taking your stupid tests. Or I'm going to try and game the system and, it looks like you're asking about ADHD, so I'm going to answer how I think, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I would say, so we get those kiddos probably, I don't know, maybe a handful of times, maybe 5 to 10 kids over the course of a year that truly refuse to the point of not doing testing. So a lot of parents think their kids won't do it and then end up doing just fine.
They talk big, but yeah.
Right. And a lot of kids are better behaved in public than at home. But we have some tricks and tools that we can use. I mean, I am not afraid to back away from the testing and play with the Rubik's Cube for a while, or let a kid draw, or go on a walk, or talk about Minecraft or whatever it might be, and give them a little break. We have a lot of license to manipulate the battery, so we can let kids kind of choose what they do next instead of us kind of going in a rote order, and that helps sometimes just to give kids some agency. In extreme cases, we might have a parent come in and sit with the kid for a little bit. That kind of disrupts the administration, but sometimes it's necessary. So we'll try to do our best with that. And then sometimes kids have to go home.
You have to punt. Yeah.
Come back a different day. Yeah.
Yep.
And what was the other question? Oh, the validity or the gaming. A lot of our measures do have validity indicators built in. So yeah, so these are just a series of questions or pattern of questions in the tests themselves that can detect, whether someone's faking one way or the other, or if the responses are invalid in some way.
The one that always stood out to me from grad school was the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic. So their testing psychologists are well aware that people try to do that, and they've built that into the test.
Yes, exactly.
In terms of technology and its growth in just everything, are there pieces of the testing battery that are done online or from the comfort of home, or is it typically all in the office? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. They're so kind of a hybrid. We do have the capability to email a lot of our behavioral checklists, and you can just fill them out online. And we can do the same for teachers, so we can email teachers the behavior checklists. Mm-hmm. And then in the office, we can't do a lot of or most of the cognitive measures outside the office because it still requires a person administering the test, a clinician. But a lot of them are available on iPads, so we do like an iPad administration, which is good for kids. They tend to be a little more engaged, as you might guess. Super fun, games. Yeah. So that helps a lot. And we use those in every battery that we do. We'll do at least 1 or 2 tests from the iPad administration.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. They're great questions.
Thank you. I'm trying. So kind of going back to, and I know you had talked about this with Dr. Nigg, to reference that again. I'll give you another plug.
Nice.
Is other diagnoses or other things you're trying to test for in terms of like bipolar or depression, anxiety. I know you had mentioned definitely the like screen addiction and technology addiction, and oppositional defiant disorder was another one you had mentioned. Are there specific assessments at this point in time for those different ones? There are a number of measures to really assess pretty much anything we're interested in. Even with kids, there's a children's depression inventory. There's children's anxiety inventory. Sadly, yes.
Yeah, right. OCD in kids. There are some very specific measures that we might use. So the short answer is yes. Bipolar is a little trickier. I think that there are certainly some quality measures, and I think as a field we're still wrestling with what pediatric bipolar looks like, and so that's an ongoing discussion.
And then DMDD will follow shortly behind, I'm sure.
Oh, sure, yeah. Right.
Sorry, that's for the layperson, that's the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, the new popular.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. The new childhood bipolar. Mm-hmm. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So I think that what that really gets to, though, is the quality of the initial interview. So really being able to get a good sense of what a kid's functioning looks like from asking parents, just asking the right questions and being sensitive to nuances in setting and environment and even time of day of the week, things like that, and really getting a good sense of what's going on with a kid. And that truly happens in the interview, not necessarily an assessment measure.
Okay. And that kind of made me think of another myth, especially on the medical end of things. I think I fall victim to this myself of like, okay, it's 2019. Like, how is there not a blood test for this or a brain scan or, things like that? So I imagine you run into that as well on the testing end.
I do. How would I phrase it? It's not usually a good context, because it's either the question of why don't we have a blood test or a brain scan, or it's the, hey, I went to this clinic who offered a blood test or a brain scan, and then you have to break the news that, that's not actually reliable. Yeah.
It's snake oil.
Yeah, exactly. So this is probably a good point just to say for parents listening and, and others, of course, that, we don't have a blood test or a brain scan for really any mental health disorder, and definitely not autism or ADHD. So if you see that advertised, and it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Yeah.
So, what are projects you're working on for 2019? I mean, obviously you got a lot of different irons and a lot of different fires. And yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Let's see. I mean, on the clinical side, just always staying on top of the research with, psych testing and neuropsych testing for kids. I launched an integrative autism assessment clinic with a local hospital, and there are pediatric occupational therapists and speech therapists over there. So that's been pretty cool. And what else? Yeah, I'm hoping to maybe partner with a medical clinic here in the next 6 to 9 months and actually put, one of our clinicians in their office full time so they can have a behavioral health setting. Yeah, which would be great. Let's see. And then on the consulting side, like you mentioned, I consult with other psychologists specifically around, putting testing and services into their practices. Okay. So, yeah, I just launched a beginner practice mastermind group for folks just getting started with testing practices. And what else? That's probably my major project right now. Yeah.
Sure. Then you got the podcast and you got
podcast, of course. Yeah. Finding quality guests.
Yeah. I know. So on the personal side of things, you're an avid runner. Are you training for anything currently, or yeah?
Yeah. Let's see. So yes, this week is week 1 of training for it's a race here in town called the Horsetooth Half, and it's notorious for being hilly. It just it goes over the foothills, up and down, and so it's a half marathon. It's got some pretty decent elevation gain.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah. Any runs on the bucket list?
Oh man, my thing is I would love to run all of they're called the World Marathon Majors. So Boston, Chicago, New York, London, Berlin, Tokyo, I think are the big ones. Okay. There might be one more, but yeah, like kind of using running as tourism and being able to go visit some really cool spots, but also like run these major races with all this awesome crowd support. Man. Yeah, I would love to.
Wow.
So,
well, good luck to you.
Thanks. New York or Chicago. Those are the next ones. I got to figure that out.
Okay. Now, have you already done Boston or? I wasn't sure.
Yep.
Wow. Yep. Man, that's impressive.
Yeah. Amazing. It's an amazing experience.
I'll throw myself under the bus here for a second. I've run one half marathon ever, and I've tried to hook my 6-year-old in, and I told her that if she can get mommy to run the Princess Half Marathon in Disney, that I will dress up as whatever princess she wants while I run the marathon. Awesome. So I've been given a challenge of Tinkerbell. So we will see.
Yeah. For your daughter's sake, I hope that
That's
happens.
Right. That's
that
right.
Sounds incredible.
All is fair.
Let's get your wife on board. That's great. Good for you.
So yeah, where can people find you on the internet? Where do they find the mastermind? Where do they find the podcast? All that.
Yeah. So the podcast, mastermind group, any consulting kind of services for clinicians, that happen on the testingpsychologist.com. And the is very important. So thetestingpsychologist.com. Okay. And you can click around and find all the podcast episodes and consulting and so forth. Awesome. And yeah, if people have questions or want to get in touch, my email address is jeremy@thetestingpsychologist.com.
Sweet. And yeah, I'll have that included in the show notes as always. So, and I do have to ask. So, my daughter Riley has one question that she gets for each podcast. So, if you were to be any animal, what would you be and why?
I saw this question on the list and I promptly forgot about it, and now I am in trouble. So I'm going to totally literally wing it, and say a bird. Yep, I would be a bird. I would be a nice bird. Maybe like an eagle, maybe an apex predator bird. Wow. So I wouldn't have to worry about things. But anyway, enough about my psyche. Being able to fly around.
Of course, the testing psychologist is analyzing his own answer.
Right. Oh my
Nice.
goodness. Totally. Yeah, let's go with eagle.
Sure. But yeah, I think a lot of people are like, the power of flight. That's pretty awesome, pretty amazing. And the sight that comes with that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Is there anything else you wish, clients, parents, kids knew before coming to testing? Anything else you would want them to know?
Yeah, I think I would just say that they don't have to be scared or worried or apprehensive about the process. That, from our perspective, it really is aimed at digging in and just getting a really intimate look at what's going on for someone, and then, translating that into what would be best for them moving forward. So they don't have to be intimidated or worried about that process, or worried about being stigmatized. That in our minds, we're just trying to be helpful and, like I said, find those strengths and support any challenges that might be present.
Yeah, definitely. I would echo that, and think that's great advice. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for being able to carve out this time. I know you're a busy guy. You got a lot of great things that you're working on, and I'm excited to turn more people on to what you're doing and just the field of testing psychology on the whole. And I'm looking forward to being able to stay in touch and kind of keep an eye on what you're doing, 2019 and beyond. I'll definitely check back in with you on the world marathons. And maybe if I'm ever out in Colorado, we can go snowboarding or something like that. Grab a beer. That'd be awesome. So,
that'd be great. We have both of those in plenitude. Yeah. So let me know. Thanks for having me on. This was great. I mean, any platform to talk about testing and dispel some myths and hopefully, help folks feel a little more comfortable with the process. That's what I'm all about.
Definitely. Well, take care and good luck to you. Enjoy the snow.
Thank you.
So to wrap up from the interview, I just wanted to kind of put out there, if you have questions, definitely you can reach out to Jeremy, Dr. Sharp, whichever he prefers to be called, and if you have questions on, do I need psychological testing or does my kid need psychological testing? A lot of times you can check in with, school counselor, what used to be called guidance counselor, and ask them, okay, what is the process for, getting an IEP in place or for getting my child particular services, accommodations, things like that. And they'll typically point you to like a school psychologist, or they may have referrals for testing psychologists within your community. And then always, just researching testing psychology in your area, your zip code, and then reaching out to them to just kind of pick their brain, get a sense of, okay, what would that entail? And then if you're, taking a loved one, a family member for that testing, you want to know going in, okay, what can we expect? What should this be like? And you almost think of it kind of like pre-op, consultation, where they'll kind of walk you through, okay, this is what you can expect. They'll either send paperwork, or it'll be an email, or it'll be something on their website to kind of look through and familiarize yourself with, and doing the best that you can to prepare them for that. Now, I know with a lot of parents, you may have kids that, they're dealing with ADHD, they may really struggle with attention and focus and hyperactivity and sitting still for long periods of time and things like that. So, just communicate with that testing psychologist and make them aware of any concerns that you have or and they'll be able to guide you in, okay, we like Jeremy said in the interview, you're allowed to take breaks, you're allowed to go to the bathroom, get a drink of water. It's not like you just strap in for this 8-hour ride and you can't do anything else. So I just want to make sure to throw that out there. Well, that ends the episode for today. Next up will be OTC episode 17 with Casey Compton of Mindsight Behavioral Group and KC Consulting. We'll be talking about workplace mental health and stress. If you liked what you've heard on the podcast, please be sure to subscribe and review wherever you're catching this podcast at. You can check out any links and resources on our detailed show notes or other episodes that have been archived at www.parentfamilysolutions.com/podcast. If you want to catch up on what Parenting and Family Solutions is doing, be sure to follow us on any of your favorite social media apps. This is your host, John Dennis, saying good night. The author and host of this podcast is not engaged in a therapeutic relationship with the listener and cannot give counseling advice without a confidential appointment. Listeners should be sure to consult with a licensed therapist in their area or seek emergency medical attention if they are experiencing psychological difficulty. A special thanks to the Topsy Turvies for the show theme song. Their song, Like a Living Dead, can be found at topsyturvies.bandcamp.com. The bump interview track was the song 1973 by Bruno E. The author and host of this podcast is John Dennis. Special thanks to producer and editor Trevor Groff.